today at the Atlanta History Center. Today is August 27th, 2003, and we're here to talk with Sister Mary Sue. Would you introduce yourself?
My name is Sister Mary Sue Thomas, and I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm here to participate in the oral history of World War II in Atlanta.
Well, we're glad to have you. Would you go ahead and tell us a little bit about that time?
Well, that time's a long time ago. The specific war years from 41 when the war was declared and the end of the war, 1945, was when I was in high school. So all of my memories are during the actual war time. Prior to the war, I was from 39 on when we were actually in the war. I guess I was not too oblivious at that time of, I was not too cognizant, of the war going on, being in grade school.
About how old were you at that time?
However old you are in high school.
Right.
The war in 1941, probably I was 13.
13.
Let's back up and tell us the day that you were born. And were you born in Atlanta?
Yes.
Where in Atlanta?
I was born in Atlanta in St. Joseph's Hospital downtown on Ivy Street.
And the date?
And the date was February 5th, 1928.
And give us your parents' names.
My parents were Charles Lewis Thomas from Kentucky originally, but lived in Atlanta for many years. And my mother was Elsie Hogan's Thomas from Geneva, Illinois.
And where were they living when you were born?
They were living in an apartment on Peachtree Road in Garden Hills. I forget the address in Garden Hills. Then they moved to Castle Pines apartment, which since burned and was rebuilt on Muskogee. And then when I was a tiny baby, we lived in a house that was built by my parents in Haynes Manor on Manor Ridge Drive.
What was the address?
357. You asked that number, and I remember that number forever. I've been by to look at that house. It's owned by a wonderful doctor now at Piedmont. He even took me through it.
Wow, that's nice.
But then we moved. When I was in high school, we moved from that address to North Stratford Road in Buckhead.
So were you on North Stratford Road
Yes.
during
When I was in high
these
school.
war times?
Right, yes.
Do you have any siblings?
I have one brother. He's 2 years younger than I, and he too went to Christ the King grade school. He was born in Atlanta in St. Joseph's Hospital, as I was.
His name?
In April 30th, 1930.
And
Is
his
date.
name?
His name is Dick Thomas. He's really Charles Lewis Thomas Jr., but he goes by Dick. Everybody in Atlanta knows him by Dick Thomas.
Okay.
And he now lives in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Can you help us out with and tell us some of the things, maybe start with the house in Haynes Manor, and tell us what the house looked like? What, how many rooms upstairs, downstairs? How did you use the rooms?
It was a beautiful house. My understanding from my mother is that my grandfather, her father, built that house for my mother and father as a wedding present. But not a wedding present, because it was when I was about 2 that we moved there. But my grandfather built the house, and he was in contracting up in Illinois. But the house was a real nice, white, beautiful house. 4 bedrooms. Downstairs was a living room, a dining room, and a kitchen, and a den, and then a basement. There was a full basement down there. I guess we played in it probably mostly. And it was a wonderful neighborhood. It was just the neighborhood that you would just grow up in and play out in the street and play with the neighbors. And there were a lot of children there. It was like neighborhoods are growing up like nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of
Single family.
games would you play outside?
Oh, hopscotch, Red Rover. What's that other thing where you have to say, may I? That's Red Rover. Jump rope, you know, usually the standard games, but always outside. I mean, always playing with the neighbors. Monopoly during the polio epidemic. That was in the 30s when it was so severe. We played Monopoly constantly.
Hmm.
My friends came and we played Monopoly till we were blue in the face.
And
Monopoly.
what was it about the polio epidemic that kept you inside?
Well, actually probably inside because it might have been the winter time. We could not go swimming in the summertime. We didn't. I mean, it lasted quite a while. It wasn't that you were going to catch it playing outside, I guess, but I just remember the game of Monopoly particularly.
Why couldn't you go swimming?
Because of the monopoly, because of the polio epidemic, there was no
So you
way
could
to
catch
go
it
into
by-
swimming pools. I don't know how you catch polio.
Did you know anyone that had polio?
I know one girl, I did not know her when she had polio, but I know a girl who still is suffering from the consequences of polio. But I didn't know her at that time. It was later that I knew
Was there any, do you remember the move?
her. Vaguely, I can tell you a funny story about the move. My brother, who was younger than I, decided he didn't want to move from that house. And so he set some kind of a little fire in the basement that required getting the fire engine there.
Oh, no.
Didn't burn the house down, but I told the man who lives there now, the doctor who took me through, and I told him about that, and he laughed, and he said, I don't know, I'll have to go check that out in the basement to see if there's any remains. But he's totally remodeled that house. You wouldn't even know it now.
Wow.
But my brother was a little kid at the time. He
Right.
thought that would work because we didn't want to leave that neighborhood.
How did you notify the police department?
That's a good question. I have no idea. I didn't.
Oh,
There was no 9/11 in those days.
No.
No. I suppose you pick up the phone and dial operator and get the fire department.
How many telephones in the house?
Maybe one. Might have been one upstairs and one downstairs, but I don't remember. I can tell you my phone number.
What's
Cherokee 3838. Isn't that a nice number to remember?
Yeah.
Cherokee 3838. Of course, that changed a lot.
Okay.
How would you make a phone call to a friend?
You just dial. It was a regular, the old-timey kind of phone, you know, the dial with a round dial on it, a black little phone.
Right.
It wasn't on the wall.
Okay, okay.
We didn't have one like that anyway.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And you just call up your friends across the street.
Was it pretty clear? Could you hear the
Yeah.
person on
Oh
the other?
yeah. Yeah.
Just as clear as it is today?
Well, I don't know. I guess. Yeah, we wouldn't have
much.
known the difference.
Right.
Maybe not as clear as today, but I think it was clear. It wasn't staticky or anything like that.
Very interesting.
And
Tell us about the house that you lived in then during this World War II period.
well, we moved from that house in Haynes Manor. We moved back to Castle Pines apartment for a short time because the other house wasn't completed yet. We lived, we moved to an apartment in Brookhaven, not Castle Pines, another apartment because the other house was not finished. And anyways, shortly the house was finished and we moved there, and it's a beautiful house. I mean, now that I look back on it, I'm wondering how in the world did we live in such a nice house.
Give us the address.
3754 North Stratford Road. You can go by and look at it now, but it's not they painted it gray, and ours was white shingle, and they painted it gray. It's two-story house with a porch on one end and a garage on the other, and set way back from the street. I think it's about 100 feet back from the street. We had a lot of property. Back in the back, it was woods, and now that's been cut by Georgia 400.
Oh,
Goes
wow.
through it, through those woods. But we had everything there. My brother had chickens. He raised chickens, And we had a dog and a cat and birds and all those kinds of things.
Mhm.
By that time, we were old enough to take care of them.
Did you have what was a routine during the day? Going to
Go to school.
You were in school. What did you wear
And
to school?
I
How
was
did you get
lucky
to
that
school?
I got a ride to school. My daddy worked downtown in the Grant Building downtown, and he took me to school, to Christ the King School from out there, North Stratford Road. And then in the afternoon, my mother either picked me up or I went home on the bus. The bus was an interesting thing. I guess we had streetcars to begin with first, before trackless trolleys. And you had to take, we had trolleys. Had to go to Buckhead and transfer to the Oglethorpe bus. Transfer at Winder and Roberts, get off, get a Coke, and go hang out for a little while, and get on the other bus and go home.
What
And
is
walk
Winder and Roberts?
Walk 7/10 of a mile down Stratford Road to home.
What was Winder and Roberts?
That was the drugstore, the only drugstore, I might add, in Buckhead. And Buckhead to me is Winder and Roberts, the Gulf Station on the corner of West Paces and Peachtree, the Gulf Station. And at the intersection of Roswell and Peachtree, there was a Jacobs drugstore. So I guess Winder and Roberts wasn't the only one, but that was the one I went to. And there was very little else in Buckhead at that time. Buckhead was just a nice little small area, crossroads. And it was a good place to be. The theater, the Buckhead Theater, that was a big highlight. Saturday afternoon double features at the Buckhead Theater, probably for 25 cents or something like that.
Okay.
Do you remember any specific movies you saw there?
Oh gosh, no, don't ask me a movie. But I recognize them when they come on TV, and I usually like to watch them.
Right.
Since we're at high school, why don't we
Sure.
change over? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Do you want to hold the mic
Okay.
and tell us your name?
My name is Sister Frances Whitman, and I'm here to share memories the same as Sister Mary Sue, and many of them are similar, but different because of the personal elements in it.
All right. Let's start back.
Mhm.
Give us your date and place of birth.
All right, I was born in Atlanta at St. Joseph's Hospital on February the 1st in 1927, so I have a year ahead of Mary Sue.
All right. And tell us your parents' name.
My father's name was Hollis H. Whitman, and my mother's name was Rosa F. Whitman. And they, at the time that I was born, I was a surprise because I was late in their life. They had had twins 19 years earlier, my brother and sister. And so I was not expected. And
Tell us your brother and sister's names.
my brother's name is Horace Whitman. It was not a junior. It was just taking two names because my dad was a twin, and so they took his twin brother's name as the H in the middle. So, and my sister's name was Rosalie Elizabeth Whitman. With that distance between, it was almost like I was just a single child. I was pretty much raised on my own. My sister still lived at home, but my brother was married early, and he was had one child named Marion Whitman, and we grew up more like sisters than we did like aunt and niece, and we lived close together. At that time of my birth, however, we were living almost right in town on Cortlandt Street. Everything now has been destroyed as far as homes there, but it was on Cortlandt Street that I was born in St. Joseph's Hospital also, so we were close by the hospital. After my birth, we lived there for about 3 years. But then we bought a house out in what was known as Peachtree Hills. And so we lived on East Drive there from the time that I was about 3 and a half until actually my sister died 10 years ago, and she still lived in the home place.
What's that address?
It's number 8 East Drive, Northeast. And My brother, after a time, bought the house next door, and so he lived there continually until about 2 years ago. So that was just our little corner, so to speak, on East Drive.
What were some of the things you did growing up?
Oh,
Sister Sue
growing
talked
up.
about games outside.
Oh,
What were you
yes.
doing?
Well, the area at that time, the only through street was Lindbergh Drive. Peachtree Hills Avenue did not go through. And so everything would dead end, except you'd have to come back to Lindbergh in order to reach Peachtree or Piedmont. And so we played everywhere, and it was really rural almost in that area. The houses that were around were more close to Peachtree. Now, Peachtree Hills Avenue was pretty residential, but when you got up where Peachtree Hills apartments are now, all of that was woods, and we played in the woods all the time. And if my mother had known, she would have been very upset because we would play around the railroad tracks over there and try, do different things. But we also loved to climb trees, and we were known for trying to build tree houses. Now, they were not very safe, as you can imagine, so there were a number of us who would fall out of the trees, and I can remember I had a bandage on my leg in every picture when I was growing up because I was a tomboy. And we loved that. Now, we would also do a lot of roller skating because of the dead-end streets, and that was a lot of fun. We had several houses that several friends who lived nearby, but not right in our, right close. You'd have to walk a little ways, a couple of blocks or so, to go and visit. And they would have, one of them had a wonderful porch, screened porch. And I can remember Mary Sue talked about playing Monopoly. And that was true. It was very much the game when we were growing up. And in the summertime, when it would be so hot, and with the polio epidemic and the scare about that at swimming pools, we weren't allowed to go swimming in public pools. So we would go up on this wonderful screened porch that had a concrete floor that was cool, and we'd sit on that concrete floor and play Monopoly all afternoon, and it was just wonderful. It just went on and on. We also were very active, some of us in the group there, were very active in acrobatics, and we took acrobatic dancing when we were growing up, and so consequently we were doing tumble salts and cartwheels and all of those things, and it was a very active time for us, and we spent all the time play. I have to say, I don't envy the children now with so much planned things, because ours was just free form. And we just played all the time, and we were in and out of each other's houses, and we'd share so many things in that way. It was wonderful.
The house that you lived in, describe it. What was
It's a bungalow. It's one of the sort of like the craftsman bungalows, that style home. And it's still very much the same as it was then. The only thing that the people who live in it now have done, they have completely renovated the inside more than the outside. And it's been, air conditioned and all those things that have been, you could do to improve it now. They love the house. In fact, they sought the house out when we put it on sale after my sister's death. They came looking for it because they were looking for that style house. It had 3 bedrooms, and it had a living dining room that was pretty much connected, and then a small breakfast room, a kitchen, and then as I was growing older, because they needed more space, my parents added a room on the back of the house, and that became their bedroom. And so it was a small house, but we had fun in it.
Describe the kitchen. What were the appliances? What was the kitchens would have been
well,
so different?
We had a back porch on which we had actually an ice box, and I would say ice box because the iceman would come and you'd have to buy big chunks of ice to put in the ice box because that was the only way you could really refrigerate things.
Did he come on a daily basis?
He would come about twice a week. You'd buy a big chunk. It had a space in it where you would put this big chunk of ice.
And it would last that
And
long?
it would last quite a while because it was sealed, and it was just so it would be things could be kept cold in that. And as the ice melted, I'll never forget this because at the basement, the floor of the porch had a hole in it, and it would drip down, and you could go down there and stand under it, and it felt so good in the hot summertime. Oh, another thing, I was very lucky in that we had a garage that was not connected to the house. It was in the backyard. And my father never used it to put the car in. He always parked the car just on the street because there was so little traffic, it didn't matter. So they did the garage over for me for a playhouse. And it was marvelous because they put up, the bars and everything, and we did all our acrobatics in there, whether it was rain or shine. And you could play house in there and stay dry. So it was a real nice experience for me to have such a nice place to play. And of course that kind of drew a lot of the neighbor children in with me. And we had a wonderful time in it. It stayed there for a long time, but it's gone now. We took it down after we couldn't really use it that much for anything else. So once I was grown, they took it down and then just redid the yard. But it was a wonderful place to play. I was trying to think of some of the other things that we did at that particular time, but I remember going to E River School for the first 4 years of school, and I believe Sue did too.
I just went there 1 year.
Oh, did you?
4th grade.
Well, I was there for 4 years. When it was the old school, it was made out of Stone Mountain granite.
Beautiful.
Gorgeous old school, just very majestic school. And it was just, one of those places that you just thought would always stay there because it was made out of that granite. But it burned later, and it was replaced by the more modern E River School now. That was back, though, in the 50s that it burned. But it lasted a long time. But then I went to Christ the King from 5th grade on, and that's when I met Sue. And we became good friends. And, of course, being a small school, it was wonderful. We got to know everybody in the school. It's great.
All right, what I'm going to do is back up and turn so that we can get both of you all in here. And we'll let you all sort of have a conversation and tell us about your high school years. Do you all remember, and just as you get whoever gets, just sort of take turns answering the question, the attack on Pearl Harbor, was that something that you all remember? And what happened? What did you think, and what was going on in the city?
I definitely remember it because it was on a Sunday, of course, and we had been to Mass at Christ the King, and came home and heard it on the radio. I think my father heard it on the radio. And then, of course, from then on, people are glued to the radio listening to that broadcast by FDR, and then the next day with the declaration of war. And I don't remember my exact reaction. I knew, it was a terrible thing to have happened. But I remember that Sunday very, very well.
Mm-hmm. I do too. It was, again, by radio that we really heard about it. Of course, it's very different to hear it. Now you see it and hear it at the same time, but then just hearing it was very, I can remember, I got cold chills. I have them right now, just thinking about how that, the impact of that. We couldn't believe, everybody kept hoping we wouldn't have to get into the war because we just felt that it wasn't our place yet. But boy, when that happened, then everything changed in the whole attitude toward war, and you could feel the tension begin to build. And even in high school, I think we knew that it was serious. Now, having an older brother, we, didn't know what that was going to mean for him about being called up to serve in the Army or something, one of the services. But he was he was working at that time in the grocery business, which was considered a vital thing. And so he was deferred And he did not have to go because he was working with A&P grocery company. And because of that, the foodstuffs and all, that was when he was never called, so. And
I remember that, in speaking of food and what Hollis did, the rationing and the food stamps and the counting these little booklets and keeping track of what you eat and what you can get, and you had food stamps for meat, food stamps for whatever, everything.
How soon did that start?
It started pretty soon.
Fairly
After we
quickly.
got into the war. Food stamps, I don't know exactly when.
probably
But-
within a year.
Probably. And the rationing of everything. I mean, now we talk about the price of gas, $1.69 or whatever it is the other day when I bought it. Well, then gas was maybe 25 cents if it was that, but it was rationed, and you had ration stamps, so you didn't drive the car very far because you couldn't get the gas. And then
Right.
there was all this bartering, I think, or trading around with people, that
Yes.
some people got more stamps, so they would share the stamps.
And tires, you couldn't get
Tires.
tires. Tires were very difficult, see, because they were sending everything rubber. And I can remember, do you remember them taking up the railing, the streetcar rails from Peachtree? Because they needed the metal. So they removed all the old
I don't
streetcar railing from Peachtree. I remember that. Because I used to walk to school up Peachtree. And so I remember when they were doing all that, it was really something. That kind of brought everything home to you, that this is really touching where you live.
How did it affect your daily routine, or did it? Sister Sue, you had said that your dad would drive you to and from, and was that affected because of the gasoline
Well,
shortage,
he
or-
continued to drive to work, as far as I recall. He never took the trolley, the streetcar
What did your
trolley.
father do?
He was in the New York life insurance business, and he was many years a top salesman. He loved it. But he had been in Ballard Biscuits before that, when he first moved to Atlanta. But then he went with New York Life, and he was with New York Life till he died. And he certainly knew about insurance. One time I was teaching history in Philadelphia, and I didn't know what I was teaching because I got to this section on insurance, and I wrote to Daddy and asked him to please send me some information on insurance. I have those booklets to this day. I just still have them. But I remember him driving me, and then he would drop me off, and then then my mother would pick me up, or I would take the trolley home.
Any chores that you all had at home? Did you have a victory garden? Sue, you mentioned that your brother had some chickens, so you must
Yeah.
have had the eggs to eat.
Yeah, we did.
What sort of things were you eating? Did you have to do any canning?
It was difficult to get fresh things, so you did try. My mother had a small garden. She didn't have a large garden, but she raised chickens as well. And so we had the chickens, and we had some of the things from her little garden that was in the back of the yard, in the back part of the yard. I remember one thing that I'll never forget. You couldn't get butter, and so you had to buy margarine, and it came in these blocks. And it was uncolored. It was just plain old white looking, lard looking. And you had this little packet of coloring that would come with it. And that was one of my jobs, was to color the margarine so it would at least look like butter when you were eating it. Oh, it was awful.
What did it taste like?
Well, it tasted pretty much like some of the margarine you get now, the cheaper brands. But at least it was something, and it was that amount of fat that would at least give a little flavor to things.
Right.
And I can remember we ate a lot of sausage type meats that you could keep well. You could spend your little coupons on that. And my mother, of course, being of German descent, loved sausage, so we had a lot of that. But it was difficult at times to get fresh things like eggs. You would have to be very, aware that you had so much and you'd use it. A lot of you ate a good bit of things like starches, macaronis and that type of thing, because that would fill you up, and it was very nourishing as well. And use very little bits of meat in with it, like, the type of spaghetti type thing, where you would get that. So it was, you understood that there was a war on.
What about clothing? Was it hard to get
Oh,
clothes?
yes. Well, clothing was difficult to get. And it would be, in this sense, the fashions changed. And like the skirts were all shorter and tighter. And you couldn't buy these long flowing things very well. And stockings. Oh, there was no such thing as stockings hardly. If you got a pair, you really wanted to hang on to them and use them only for special occasions. So they developed. Do you remember that?
That was silk stockings at
Yes,
that, and then
yes.
rayon stockings.
And then rayon, which were awful because
They were terrible.
they wouldn't fit well, and they would bag. You had to keep pulling at them. And then in the summer, they developed some kind of, they're doing it now again, the tan that you could just sort of paint on. And that's what women would
Yeah.
use. They would paint their legs and even try to paint the seam down the back to see if they could look like they had on hose.
Because
It
the
was-
stockings all had seams in them.
In
They were
those,
not
in those days.
Well,
That's why-
did you wear uniforms to
We,
school?
we never wore uniforms at Christ the King
Well,
at all.
tell me what you wore. What is something, describe the outfit that you would wear to school, head to toe.
Head to toe. Well, that picture that I said I have has a beautiful picture of me, I guess in my senior year or junior year. And I remember the outfit. It was a sweater that was like it's not nylon. I mean, it's not what they make now. I guess it was wool. A blue sweater and a blue and white check skirt and loafers and bobby socks, penny loafers. And that was my standard uniform with a string of pearls, a single strand of pearls. And I wore those all the time. They weren't real, but they were pretty.
Was all of it store-bought or?
Oh
did you
yeah.
have it-
Well, my mother sewed a lot for me. She liked to sew, and she sewed well. But most of, I think, my school clothes were bought. And the nearest store to us, really, department store, was Davison Paxson downtown on Peachtree, and you'd have to take the trolley down there and go into Davison's. And my daddy knew a lot of people at Davison's because of his business. And I used to love to go to Davison's. In fact, when I was a little small child, I met Amelia Earhart there at Davison's downtown in the tea room or some such place. But I was very small then, very small. But I do remember the event. That was when I was in grade school.
Did your teachers talk much about the war during school?
I think they were talking mostly about trying to get us to learn something and be still and stop talking.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure they did. Specifically,
I would say that they talked about it. I think Sister Mary Sheila was probably the one that spoke about it most because she was teaching us American history. And so I think that was one point that she would bring out quite often, the way things are and the way things used to be and how the history of the wars of America, and she would talk about that. And the interesting part was that in the school was actually in the basement of the church. It was not it was not part of what had been the elementary school. And so it was like another little world that we were just kind of this small group of students there. We had boys in the first year. We had boys up through freshman year, and then the boys went to Marist. And so from actually the sophomore year on, it was just a girls' school. So we were pretty close-knit as a group. And we were the smallest, so we really knew each other well. And I can remember going and spending the night at Sue's over when she was on Stratford Road. And we had a wonderful time doing that.
How many girls were there in your class?
8,
8.
Eight.
Eight.
And this was the class of
45.
1945.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Some of the there were probably maybe at any one time up to 125 girls in the whole
In-
school. but it was never a large school. And it closed, Christ the King High School closed in the year that St. Pius X High School opened. There were two girls' schools in Atlanta, two girls' Catholic schools. One was Sacred Heart School downtown, and Christ the King. And
when did Duville Academy?
and Duville Academy did not come about until the 60s,
Yeah, it
around the
was early
60s.
60s, yeah.
But
And
when those two schools closed and Pius X school opened, then Duville came on later, and it was only here for about 10 years, Duville Academy.
Yeah. But still, we still keep in touch with the people we were in school with. In fact, Mary Sue just celebrated her 50th Jubilee as a Grey Nun. And so we had two of them there besides us.
Two of our classmates.
Two of our classmates who graduated with us. And we still keep in touch with all of them except one we've lost contact with, and we wish we could find her. But, you know, it's harder to find women if they change their names. And I believe she married someone in the military. So that means that, you know, it's very difficult to locate her. We had a wonderful time. And I remember going to Sue's to spend the night, and they had a man there who was Vance. Vance was his name. He could make the best cinnamon rolls ever. And we'd have those for breakfast.
Vance started out as a yard man, but then my mother discovered what a great cook he was. So he kind of transitioned into cooking. He was a wonderful man, wonderful man. We loved him. We usually, we were fortunate enough in those days. We had a cook. We had a maid who was a cook. I guess she was, we had even a room where she stayed. She had her own little suite in our house on Stratford. And then Vance was supposed to be the yard man, but Vance died eventually, and so it fell to my brother to be the yard man when he got old enough to push the lawnmower.
Were there any, did you all feel like there were any restrictions? I mean, what precautions would you take? Were there air raid shelters? Were there blackout curtains? I mean, was there anything like that you all remember?
Yeah, my father was one of the wardens, they called them, the air raid, and they were in like neighborhoods. They would take certain neighborhoods, and there would be, you know, drills that he would have to go to. And he would, you know, like at night sometimes he would have to go out and kind of patrol the up and down the streets of the neighborhood. And it was just one of those things they were required to do in case anything happened. You never knew what might occur. And so it was just strictly, and he had like a gas mask and all the things that would go with an air raid warden. And so he would patrol sometimes at night. It would just depend on how things were going in the war, you know. A lot of that didn't impact us, I think, as immediately, except that we did, and we were very aware of the servicemen because we would go down on Sunday afternoons.
That's what I was going to.
I think it's Sundays, yeah, to the Knights of Columbus Hall. And we would have dances, you know, and so the young servicemen would come, and we were of the age that we would go down and have a ball. And it was wonderful.
Where was the Knights of Columbus Hall?
It was on
Peachtree, right about where the art center is now, right around that
Just
part
around
of Peachtree.
15th
Near
Street.
Peachtree, 15th, 14th.
Yeah. And it was just one of those centers where, you know, they would have like tea dances is what they would call them in those
They
days.
were in the daytime on Sunday afternoon,
Mhm.
and it was fun to go there. And I don't know if any budding romances ever happened, but
Well, I think a number of us dated some of them, do you know? But it was because they were only here briefly. There was a naval air station out in Chambly, where the DeKalb Peachtree Airport is now. There was a naval air station, and there was the Army had a general hospital, Lawson General Hospital, in the same area. And in fact, I worked there one summer, yeah, when I was a junior. I don't remember how I got the job, but I worked in the engineering thing, and basically it was just counting nuts and bolts. You know, they were doing inventory, and oh my Lord, that was something else, because it was so hot. You were in these Quonset huts, you know, and the only thing you had were big fans, no air conditioning of any kind. And I loved it, though. I had a wonderful time, because after work they would have baseball games, and you could go to the baseball games where some of the patients who were ambulatory, you know, and you could go and you could be with them. And it was, you know, it was a really nice time in that sense, but it also brought home very seriously what war does to people, because of some of them, you know, were amputees. And you would go and you'd be with them and just talk with them after work, you know, and sort of just share the games and so on with them. So that was the serious part of the war for me. When I was a junior, I really became very aware of the sadness that was there, you know, for the families and for the people, and the horrors of war. And but that was my biggest memory of things that touched my life, in the actual war touching my life. Because in my family, we were very fortunate. We didn't lose anybody. I had a number of cousins, but they were all safe, and they all came home safely. But that really brought it home, and it made you understand. And I was a little older by then and kind of knew the sadness, you know, of seeing so many of the young men so, you know, really debilitated, not being able to do things for themselves. But it was great to be able to be out there with them, and, you know, I think it helped. We hope it did. That's what we did it for. And but my job was
Counting the nuts.
Counting nuts and bolts.
Do you remember how much you were paid?
Oh, heavens. Minimal. You know, I mean, probably $1 an hour or something like that, or $2 an hour. I mean, it was unbelievable. But I thought it was a fortune. Because I remember I bought myself, for my senior year, I bought myself 3 skirts and 2 sweaters out of my summer earnings. So, and things weren't very expensive, you know.
Did you buy them at Davison's?
Or Rich's. We would go down to Rich's. Downtown was really the place you had to go.
You had to go there.
Yeah,
Go
there
to the
was
Francis
nothing.
Virginia Tea Room for
Oh,
lunch.
yes, for lunch. That was a nice place.
Yeah, that was a nice treat.
And
Or
Rich's Magnolia Room.
Rich's Magnolia Room was gorgeous, beautiful.
To go downtown, was it on the weekends?
Most of the time for me
yes,
it was on
yes.
Saturdays.
Did you go down with friends or your parents? Was it a family trip? What was the trip downtown?
If we went down shopping, it would usually be with friends, and just get on the trolley and go right down to Davison's, to the corner there, and
all
go to
the
the
theaters,
movie.
yeah, the
You know, the
theaters were
Lowe's
there,
Grand Theater,
except-
where Gone with the Wind premiered. Had been in that theater for thousands of times. It was only the Lowe's Grand
And the Paramount.
and the Paramount downtown,
And
and
then
then the
there was a
Buckhead
Rialto,
Theater out
wasn't-
here, and the
wasn't-
Rialto Theater.
Yeah.
There were 3 theaters downtown.
And then, of course, the Fox. And
Oh, Fox, don't forget the Fox.
whenever we could, we would try to get down and go to a matinee at the Fox. That was the big thing.
Well,
because
tell us about the Fox Theater.
Well, it was just like inside, just like it is now. They really did a beautiful job. You know, having the clouds and the stars and all on the ceiling was just wonderful. And we used to go down, and they had the big Mighty Mo, or whatever they call the organ, and you would have, the organ would play at the matinees, and you would sing along, and it was a lot of fun. And I remember my absolute favorite actor at the time was Humphrey Bogart. I just thought he was the end of all. And I would always try to get down to see all the Humphrey Bogart pictures they usually played at the Fox. And I don't know, that was just one of the big things. And of course, you knew about the stars, you know, that were in the war effort, like the Clark Gable and all of those. And so you would see any of the pictures that they would make. You'd always try to go and see those, of the war pictures. And I think that really did bring the war home to people more than a lot of our own. We didn't really have that much visual contact with the war except through movies. you
And the
know.
news.
And the
And there was
news.
always a newsreel and a
Yeah.
comedy with the movie. You got, at the Fox, you would get the organ concert, the sing-along, which was a lot of fun, and then the not commercials, the news,
Ads for the new
uh,
reviews.
news, and a comedy,
Mhm.
and then the movie. So you really got your money's worth down there.
Yeah.
But I loved the theater itself. The
Mhm.
building itself is so beautiful, and
Mhm.
it's wonderful that it was able to be restored and preserved, and restored. It's a beautiful place. But those movies were just
Yeah.
fun to go to, just
And
fun.
also at that time, when you had proms or big dances, sometimes they would be at the Georgian Terrace. They had a nice ballroom there, and they would have, a lot of the proms would be at the ballroom down there, and if you got invited to somebody's prom, we didn't really have.
I don't think we had a senior prom at Christ the
No.
King, because we
Well,
had different things with Marist, but
yeah,
I went to a dance, a sorority dance
yeah.
at Georgian Terrace when I was
Mhm.
in a sorority, and it was mostly
High school.
it was all high school girls, and some from Sacred Heart and some from Christ the King and some from public school. And that whatever that sorority was, we had our big dance at the Georgian Terrace in that gorgeous ballroom, which I think is still there. I've gone through around the Georgian Terrace, the old part of Georgian Terrace.
Well,
Yeah.
tell us about going to the prom then.
Oh, the prom was great. I mean, we
Remember what you wore?
that's the kinds of things that my mother sewed. My mother made beautiful dresses, and Mama always made I didn't go to that many proms, but we didn't even call it a prom. It was just
No,
the sorority
sorority
dance. It's
dances.
what it was, formal dance.
Mhm.
And I guess it was made out of tulle and just frilly and no strapless and all that stuff. You wouldn't wear that. You wouldn't dare wear that. But just pretty, and full skirts and.
And sometimes Georgia Tech too, if you knew some of the people that were at Tech, you'd get invited to dances there, and that's when you would go formal like that, and you would have, I can remember one pink dress that I had was long sleeve, high neck, but it was beautiful because it was sheer, the sheer sleeves and then the full bouffant skirt, and I remember that so well. That was the one that just really stayed with me. I love that pink
What
dress.
about drinks like Coca-Cola or your favorite candy back then?
Coca-Cola
Only
was
Coke.
it.
Nothing else.
And then all you had was
And
what
just Coke, real
Yeah.
Coke, and that's why
Yeah.
I was so thrilled when they made classic Coke, because
Yes.
it tastes like the real thing.
the real thing.
But the real thing is from the soda fountain of the drugstore.
And that's what Jacobs and Buckhead
that's
would
what
always
Jacobs
have,
and Winder and Roberts.
They
They
had a soda
It
fountain.
was a soda fountain, and you did buy Coke in the bottles.
Yeah.
They make such a big to-do now about those little green bottles that are Coke bottles, and that's all it came in. They were the smallest ones, 6 ounces, and we did have Coke in bottles, but the best Coke is a cherry Coke from Winder and Roberts or Jacobs. Not a cherry Coke out of a can.
No.
It does not even taste kin to a cherry Coke. But the Coke was the main thing that people drank, or milkshakes.
A lot of times too, sodas. I loved chocolate soda, and so
Oh,
I would
yeah,
get a
soda.
chocolate soda. You don't find those anymore. I've looked around, and there's not a place in Atlanta that I know of where you can get just a plain good chocolate soda. And that was what I loved.
Did they have other flavors beside Coke, like grape or
Oh yes, there was
Oh,
a
yeah.
company called Knee High in
Mhm.
Atlanta. It's no longer in existence. Knee High grape, and they had grape and orange and those kinds of flavors.
Oh,
But-
we almost forgot about the varsity.
Oh God, we gotta talk
That
about
was a big thing. The varsity was here, and we
And the
used
varsity
to,
was small, about this big as this table maybe. And was it Willie? Was the famous one that was only retired? I mean, he must have been 95 years old. But you'd go down there, and it was no going into the varsity like you do now. You drive in your car. And this, of course, we could not do that until we were like juniors in high school,
Yeah.
but we did it. and go to the varsity with a gang of kids.
Pile them in the car.
And pile them in the car, and they put the tray on the window. You had to roll the window up just a little bit so it would clamp onto the window and then onto the door of the car. And then we had those wonderful, wonderful chili hot dogs. Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
And varsity orange.
And a varsity
was the
orange,
big thing too.
which I got a varsity orange down there not long ago, a year or so ago, and it's not really as good. It's not the same, but it's still called a varsity orange.
Yeah.
It's good, and the hot dogs are still pretty good.
Yeah. And what was that drink that you could get downtown? It was orange, and it had like milk and
Was that the
ice
spinning wheel
cream.
at the corner of your street?
well, there was
There was a spinning
there was
wheel.
a spinning wheel, which was more like a really thick shake, like a what do they call it now at Wendy's? What do you?
A Frosty.
Frosty.
at
It was
Wendy's.
more like a Frosty. But this was Orange Tico, it was called. And there was a special little place next to the Lowe's Grand Theater.
Oh, yes.
Do you remember that?
Mhm.
And it would be served in a soda glass, but it had it would probably be reminiscent of a creamsicle now, with the orange juice and the ice cream and some soda in it. That was wonderful. So when you went down to the movie, that was one of the things you tried to take enough money along for that too.
And you have to remember that in those days you would get one of these things, which today would probably cost you $4.50, and it might have cost 25 cents or 50 cents at the most. It was just an amazing difference in the money
Mhm.
and what money would buy
Yeah.
in the 30s and 40s compared to today.
What did during that time was a time of segregation,
Mm-hmm.
and what do you remember about segregation, or about did you have friends that were black, or what do you
Yeah.
remember about that?
No, mostly the people that you knew would be working for you as maids, either cleaning house or cooking, yard people. Really and truthfully, you didn't have a lot of contact with people your own age who were black. I didn't.
No, I never did either. The only black people, African American, that I knew were those who worked for us. And we loved them. I mean,
Yeah.
they were like members of the family. There was always they had their own room in our house, most the houses that I lived in. And the first black lady that I had when I was very small, named Nellie, she was just, absolutely like my surrogate mother almost, because she was like what we would call nowadays a nanny.
A nanny. Uh-huh.
And I have no idea how much money she made, but we absolutely adored that woman. She was just like part of the family. And then when we moved to the Stratford Road address, I think Nellie had died, or Nellie died soon afterwards, and we got another maid whose name was Sarah. But my brother and I nicknamed her, and we still call her Squeegee. Don't ask Squee. Squee moved during the war, when the war came, she moved to Detroit to get, as many black people did from Atlanta, moved to Detroit and worked up there, and we lost track of her. But
Why did they move to?
they moved because they got jobs up
Jobs.
there
Mhm.
that they could not get down here, because as Francis said,
Very
due to the
limited.
times, the jobs that were available for black people were really housekeeping type
Yeah. Very
chores, and
limited.
to get into something, and I guess in the war industries up in Detroit, the pay was a whole lot better.
Yeah. And they would train them,
Uh-huh.
for that. So a number of families moved up, and it was, and the war effort was seeking people to do that, to go into the factories to make the different, ammunitions and the different things for the war effort. And so I could see why they would want to go. I can remember that they never were allowed into the restaurants. They would be able to go to a back door, or they'd have a special place where they could come and do takeout. But they were not allowed in just the usual restaurants, like we talk about Francis Virginia Tea Room and places like that, and the Magnolia Room and all, but they were never allowed, and they did not, they might serve you, they might be waitresses, but, or waiters, but they would not be allowed to eat in the same area where you were.
Did that feel, at that age, did you, you know, you were children at that
Yeah.
time, and, you know, hindsight, you have the luxury of looking back, but at that time, did it just seem the norm?
It was definitely the norm.
It
And it
really
was not even considered, and you'd see signs over water fountains, you know, colored only, and you knew not to go there. It was just one of the things that was so totally accepted, you never questioned it at that time. It wasn't really until the 60s that a lot of that started to happen, and it made a big impact on Atlanta, and fortunately.
We've got about 5 minutes left. So would each of you all, I'm just going to leave the camera where it is, tell us just a little bit about after high school, sort of, you know, what happened since then. And then if there's anything that you want us to know that you would like to put on the tape. I mean, how you, sort of when you think back, did this World War II era influence you in any way, or just your thoughts on it? If each of you would take about 5 minutes to do that. Catch us up on how you got to where you are today, too.
Well, when I graduated from high school, I went to college for 1 year up in New Jersey, St. Elizabeth's College, a great big college. But I didn't like it much, so I transferred to a college where I had really won a scholarship anyway in the first place, Maryville College in St. Louis, Missouri, and I graduated from there. And subsequently then I entered the convent, and then due to various circumstances I came home for a couple of years, then I went back. And so I've just celebrated my 50th anniversary as a nun. In the interim time when I came home, I worked for a law firm here in Atlanta, Mr. Alec W. Smith's law firm, and loved it. And then subsequently I went back to the convent, which is where my first calling was anyway. And then I've taught, I've done various ministries as a nun. The World War II era, to look back on it, it's wonderful to be able to look back on it and trigger, you know, memories, but the reality of the war and the reality of segregation during those times, and as Francis said, the African American people, which term we didn't even use in those days, the black people, it was just an accepted thing, and that's very, very sad. But that was just the way we were, as the movie was. Growing up in this part of Atlanta, there were no black people out here except those on the maids that were coming to work for these people that lived out here. I mean, all you have to do is ride down Paces Ferry Road, and they probably had 25 maids each one. But we just had no opportunity to have any contact. Now, if I had gone to public school, perhaps there would be some black people there, but probably not at North Fulton.
I don't think so.
North Fulton High School. I doubt it, because of the segregation, the areas of Atlanta were very definitely segregated. And looking back, it was a terrible thing to do. But during the time and growing up, even as a teenager, I think we didn't even think much of it, really.
I don't think it was part of our recognition, you know. I mean, we were so tied into our own group, I think that was what it was. Well, when I left Christ the King High School, I won a year's scholarship to Siena College in Memphis, Tennessee. So I did go up there for a year. But then my family really weren't able to afford to give me the rest of the college education. So I came home and I went to Drawn Business School, and I learned to be a secretary. Well, I had really, tell you the truth, wanted to go to Georgia Tech, but at that time that was unheard of. Women did not go to Georgia Tech. I wanted to go and study architecture. And so when I got through with my secretarial course, I decided, well, I'm going to look for work with architects. So I did. And I got a job with Griff Edwards, who had his own small firm in the Lowe's Grand Theater building at the time. And I worked for him, and at that same time, John Portman, who was subsequently his partner, was working there, and then they formed a partnership. But in the meantime, I had gone over and I was working with Toombs, Amasano, and Wells, and I had worked with Stevens and Wilkinson also. I was what you call a delayed vocation to the convent. I was not really, I was having a good time. I had a ball, and I was kind of burning the candle at both ends. But then we came to the time when the Orly crash, and we had very close friends in that Orly crash who were killed. And I think it brought home to me really what life, how precious life is. And I began to think, in
the Orly crash?
This was when the High Museum of Art had a sponsored a flight to Paris to go and visit the famous museum there. What is it? I've forgotten the name of it.
Probably the Louvre.
The Louvre.
This is the anniversary.
And this is the anniversary.
This month is
This
the
month.
About 40th anniversary, perhaps,
Yeah.
of that crash.
And it really was something that came home to me when I lost friends who were on that plane. And I guess I started really thinking more seriously about, well, where am I going? And of course I had known Sue all along, and I had another 2 or 3 good friends who were sisters. And I started thinking about it, and so I explored it and decided that that was going to be the next step for me. So I entered the Grey Nuns in '64, and I'm happy I did. I wouldn't have done anything else. If I had known earlier, I probably would have gone earlier. But, you know, things started to change for the church at that time, because that's when we had the Vatican Council too. And Pope John 23rd, really opened the doors of the church to modernize it. And I think maybe I needed to wait. And so since then, it's been things different. And now I'm, I guess, still working within the structure of the church. I work with in the Metropolitan Tribunal Office, which is the court system of the Catholic Church. So I really am very happy in what I'm doing, and this has been a wonderful opportunity to look back with Sue and bring forth some of our memories that we just don't always talk about them, do we?
Never,
Mm-mm.
never. And
it's just been a wonderful. I think this project is marvelous. It just intrigues me, and I hope someday maybe we'll be able to really see what has come from what hopefully our contribution may be to it. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Sue, for.
I appreciate it too, very much. I was thinking as you said something or other, I'm sort of come full circle. You said where you work now. I work at the hospital at St. Joseph's Hospital. I was born at St. Joseph's Hospital downtown, and I work at St. Joseph's Hospital out where Peachtree Dunwoody now, and so it's kind of like full circle. But this is a wonderful experience, and I'm very grateful to Nancy Brooks for bringing it to my attention.
Yes. All right. Anything else you all want to add?
No, except just thanks, Sue.
Thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much
you
for
very much.
inviting
Thank you,
us.
Archer.